wise decision to upgrade from Windows 7 and some of the older equipment that we have. Y'all forgive me, I've got some kind of allergy I've had for a while. This really bothered my throat. Let me grab my water. So the first thing I want to do is, let's go back and repeat Sunday, okay? No, I'm kidding. The slideshow didn't work. We don't know why, but I think it's going to work tonight. And I just want to go through the first little part. It's about my wife and I and what the Lord's been doing in our life for about the last 30 years. And just share briefly with you about that, answer any questions you guys have, and then we'll have a devotional from the Lord's Word. So we are, Cindy and I are emeritus missionaries. That just means we've retired after a certain number of years in good standing with the IMB. Many emeritus missionaries are truly retired, not just retired from the IMB and still working. And they travel and they share what's going on around the world. They stay in touch with the IMB and with missionaries on the field, and they help supplement the ability to get out and speak in churches and keep the churches informed. Now, we do things really interesting, rather unique. We had a lot of friends over the years. We'd go places and there would be missionaries from other organizations. At the International Mission Board, we didn't raise money for ourselves. We never had to ask for money. What we did was we would share what we were doing with Southern Baptist churches, and usually the first thing we'd say is, we're your missionaries, whether you even ever met us before or not. And there are 4,000 more out there, and we just want to share with you what we've been doing with the resources you've provided for us, and how we're planting churches, how we're sharing the gospel, how we're working in medical ministry or many different ministries that the IMB has. And they started doing this over 175 years ago. That's been the way that missionaries have been supported. Most organizations, you have to go and find churches to support you, and many times a church will get a new pastor and he doesn't want to support that missionary anymore, or something happens in the church and then the person, they lose 10%, 30%, half their salary or something, and they may have to come home and raise support again just to stay on the field. So we don't have that issue. We do make ourselves accountable to the churches, and all missionaries are on the same kind of pay scale. It doesn't matter if you're more a lawyer or a doctor in your civilian life before you came to the board. We all get paid the same. We all serve for the same financial resources. And that just was something we were doing in the last 20 to 30 years, while we've been at the board mainly. Our board decided to do something different, not in how they raised support, but in how they worked in the world. There was a study done 20, 25 years ago, and there was a big meeting of mission agencies like the presidents of these mission organizations all over the United States and Europe. And they gathered together, and I think they were somewhere in Asia. They had a big meeting, and they started looking at what is the challenge that we're facing to get the gospel to the world. I mean, we've made really good progress toward reaching the unreached. And they began to realize there are still unreached people groups out there who don't have a gospel witness. They're less than 1 or 2% evangelized. There just aren't enough believers within their group to continue sharing and help them grow and become evangelized, reached in a sense. And the problem is most of these are in places where it's difficult. It's illegal, like in Muslim countries, to share the gospel, proclaim the gospel, and certainly to baptize someone who comes to faith. Same way in many communist countries. And so missionaries faced challenges and persecution and other things. And so what they started doing is having missionaries that would go secretly into a country. Now, all of our missionaries, over half of our missionaries, I'm in the minority serving in Brazil. Over half of our missionaries today are in places where they're taking a risk of some kind for the gospel. And not only that, it's illegal in that country, or it's a cultural thing that they will be persecuted for sharing the gospel. All of our missionaries are legally in every country they go to. They have a visa, and they go in as a doctor. They go in as a counselor for alcoholism. We call it a platform. You find some way to legally get in the country and do something. I met one, I won't share his name because he doesn't want his name out there. He runs coffee shops. And he did this, he had a business with coffee shops. He had 2 or 3 coffee shops, and he started setting up coffee shops overseas in big cities, and he hires local people to work in the coffee shops. And over time, some of them come to become believers because he always has a little party room in his coffee shop, which is a good business deal, but that's also a nice place to shut the door and meet with people that want to know about the gospel. And so he has a little room. All of his coffee shops have like a little, private party area, or, business company's going to go in there and they sit down and have coffee and they talk or whatever. And he uses that for the gospel. Now, I want you to think, if they were in another organization and they came to your church and they said, I can't tell you my name. I'm using a fake name. I can't tell you where I'm going or what I'm doing, but I need your money. Kind of hard, isn't it? It'd be very hard. And unless people that did know them could vouch for them or whatever, it would be just impossible. And we don't have to do that because our missionaries are all covered through the support in the churches. And those like my wife and I and others who aren't in that category of having to keep our names secret, we can share with you. We know these people, that we've worked with them. We know what they're doing. They're serving the Lord. And we're not saying give us money. We're saying just continue to support Lottie Moon and the International Mission Board. And half of our missionary, actually over half today, are in that category. So missions has changed a lot over the last 25 years. Anyway, I just want to share a little bit about what God's had us doing and a little bit about our family, and hopefully you're going to get to meet my daughter and her husband and really get to meet my wife this weekend. They're getting over COVID. She's feeling better today. John, my daughter's husband, he's better. My daughter's feeling better, not quite well yet. The baby's better, and my wife is feeling much better. So let's go to the next slide. We started out here in the Amazon rainforest. That's the family on a pier in a little village, a little river village, and it's a village where we had a Baptist church, and that church was actually pretty strong, 50 to 80 people, very solid, and had a lay pastor, but he knew the Bible very well. And we were helping that church plant another church, and we came with a team, and we did like a weekend of training with them on discipleship and evangelism and church planting. And so we decided to take our kids with us on this trip. We had a doctor, a couple of doctors, a nurse, a pharmacist. We did medical ministry while we're there. Many of these villages have no doctor. They have to get in a boat and go hours to the nearest clinic, not even a hospital, to get any kind of medical care. And it was a nightmare because we had these little kids who were on this boat, and the rails, would be so high they could just fall underneath the rail and fall off the boat. So we had to assign people to watch our kids the whole time we were trying to do ministry. Somebody had to watch each one of the 3 little ones. Bethany, I don't know how old they are. The little ones it was before, they were probably 4 and 5. James is 3, and the older one there is Bethany. And Bethany's supposed to be here this weekend. She and her husband, they're in residency at Vanderbilt University. They're both doctors. She's a pediatrician, and he's a internal medicine specialist, and he's going to specialize in cardiology, and she's going to do an ER fellowship and be a pediatric ER doctor. And so they're in their last year at Vanderbilt, and then they have 3 more years. It's like, 4 years of medical school, and then 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency, and then they want to specialize, and it's 3 more years. So it's 14 years before they, I don't know. I don't have that much endurance, I don't think, to do that, but they do. Anyway, they work all kind of hours. Just so you understand why my wife is not here, they work like, John's was on a 24-hour shift the other day, a 28-hour shift. He had to overlap with someone. And so they work these long hours, 80 hours a week most weeks. it's a swing shift. They go and they do this for a while, then they go and do something else for a while, because they're still learning. Even though they're practicing medicine, they're still learning and developing their skills. And so they could both be on night shift, like tomorrow night, and who's going to take care of a newborn baby? Now, the hospital has child care for the people that work there, about a 5-month left on the waiting list. And they tried to sign up as soon as they found out they were pregnant. So for the next 5 months, there's just not anything except my wife, Cindy. And she's not too disappointed, I'll be honest, but she's getting to be grandma. But that's really what she's doing. She's ministering to them, taking care of the baby so they can be free to continue their residency and finish their work. And they both have this weekend off, which is rare. So they're going to come down and come to worship here, and you guys will get to meet John and Bethany, the baby, and Cindy will be here this weekend too. If we can go to the next one. So we went from the jungle, the Amazon forest, to the Black Forest. We spent about 16 years, 15 years, I guess, on our first part of our career in Brazil. And our goal was always to train people to do what we were doing, to make church planters. And then I trained people to train church planters. And the state association, we partnered together and partnered with some of the local associations as well, and with some other organizations that were church planting in the Amazon region. And by the time we were ready to leave, Brazil had gone from about 5, in the area we were working, it was about 5% evangelical Christians, so it was not totally lost, but 95% of the people would not understand the gospel. They were nominal Catholic, and I used to ask people, well, you can talk about spiritual things with Brazilians. They're spiritual people. They're very open to that. And I'd say, so if I want to go to heaven one day, what do I need to do? And they go, well, and about a third or fourth or more would say, I don't know. They would just be honest. I don't know. And some of them would say, well, you got to be good, right? And then some of them would say, has something to do with faith. And that was really about all they knew. And so I'd ask them, well, what do you do for your faith? Well, I'm Catholic. Oh, okay. Well, what does it mean to be Catholic? Well, I don't really go to church. I mean, the priest only comes to our river village once a year, and he just criticizes us for being sinners when he comes, and no one wants to listen to that, And so, or something, or maybe they're in a town, where they do have a church, but they don't go to church. Easter, maybe Christmas, somebody has a wedding or somebody dies, they go. But other than that, they don't really go to church. And they say, well, but there is a little chapel down here, and there's a lady, you go to her, and she will help you pick out the right saint to pray to. So if you need to get married, well, that's Saint Anthony, I think it is, So she'll pick out the little statue of him and set it there. And she has this little shawl. She puts a prayer cloth. She puts around him. And then she wraps it around her and wraps it around you to, connect the spiritual energy there. And you'll pray for what you need. And it's a lot of mystic stuff that they do, And then if you get upset with somebody, there's a guy out on the edge of town. You go out there, and he'll put a curse on them, if you need to really take care of somebody. So they're going to the macumbeiro, it's called, macumba, which is the black magic in the region. And I say, oh, so is that's Catholic? Yeah, that's what Catholics do. And so they have just mixed all this, syncretized all these belief systems into their Catholic faith. And you can't blame a lot of them, because a significant percentage, they've never learned to read or write. They've never been to school. Or if they have, they've been to elementary school, and that's it. And so they just don't have a background, and they've just grown up and heard this, and to them, it's true. And so we would share with them the gospel. I would say, well, you believe in Jesus, right? Oh, yeah, he's the Son of God. God's the Father. He's the Creator. The Bible's the Word of God. So they're already so close, And so we would just open the Bible and say, well, why don't we look at what the Bible says on this? They go, well, I can't see so good. I don't have glasses. They never want to say I can't read. They just say, I don't have good glasses. My old glasses don't work good anymore. I said, oh, I'll read it to you. No problem. And we would just share from the Scripture, what the gospel was and what we need to do to be right with God, to be forgiven. And many of them, the Holy Spirit would touch them. They're religious people, and they would hear that, and they would be willing to respond. Some would not, but the ones that did not, we just say, would you like to learn more about this? And they go, yeah, I'm interested. And we would start a Bible study in their home. And then we would get some of the homes together and have several families meeting together and begin to work with those families until they came to faith and they were ready to be baptized. And eventually, they would usually build a building. I told them, you don't have to go to the expense of building a building. You can meet in homes and have a church. But they eventually want to gather, and Brazilians like big events, They like to gather and party and sing and dance, and so their church services are sometimes very animated. But that was really the method we used to plant churches in the remote and the rural areas. And over time, and it wasn't us, okay, God just was at work in Brazil the last 100 years. And there's been a phenomenal growth. And it went from 5% to 23% in like 2 census periods, which was 15 years or so, because one of the censuses had been out for about 5 years before, and then the last one came out. And that's an amazing, and we're talking millions of people. Brazil's 200 million people, so when you go from 5% to almost 25%, that's a lot of people that have come to Christ and become evangelicals. And I did my PhD dissertation on the growth of one group in Brazil. One day I want to write a book about it. I'll take the data and write a book. It'll be from 2 to 20 million. Because 2 missionaries, Swedish Baptist missionaries, who came through the U.S., they left Sweden because of economic difficulties in Europe and came to the U.S. to live, learned English. They came from the U.S. to Brazil, and they started a church and a movement of church planting that grew to 20 million in about a century. It took a while. It's now the largest evangelical denomination in the Western Hemisphere. It's up in the 25, 30 million, somewhere in there now. So it's bigger than the Southern Baptist Convention today. And we've been the biggest for a long time in the Western Hemisphere. We're actually declining slightly, unfortunately. And they're growing phenomenally. So we are here in this church facing the challenges of not post-Christian, but moving that way. And they are still growing pretty phenomenally. And so when you look around, we tend to look at where we are, don't we? We don't have blinders on, but we just don't look. If you go to CNN or Fox News, you're not going to hear about how many people came to faith in Asia last year, or how many believers there are in China, or how Iran is having a phenomenal just awakening going on. The number of people that are leaving Islamic faith and coming to Christ in Iran is just phenomenal. And it's hard to put numbers down because obviously they're being secret about it. But we have people who are maybe not living in Iran, living in another country, going in and out. They have some kind of a job like importing and exporting, some sort of business that the IMB has connected them with people that are business people, and they have partnership, and they work with them. And that's their way of getting in and out of the country, and they're working in these countries. And we got to see some of that, and I'll share. But the Christian faith is growing around the world today. And it's growing rapidly. It's mainly, if you want to say, what is the average Christian, like the median Christian person in the world? They live south of the equator. They don't live in Europe or the U.S. We're the minority. They live south of the equator, South America, Central America, Africa, and the southern part of Asia. That's where the majority of Christians in the world live today. And they have a very simple faith, a very biblical faith, because most of them have been reached by evangelical missionaries who taught them the Bible, taught them the basics of the faith. They don't have a lot of the traditional beliefs that we have. And quite a number of them are charismatic. Probably more charismatic than non-charismatic, but not all of them. You won't find them, the majority are not the health and wealth gospel group. that has unfortunately tainted that pool and in the U.S. as well. But most of them are not in that category. If I were to ask you, the U.S. is the largest mission sending country in the world, what would you think is number 2 and number 3? Just guess. It's not in Europe. No. Brazil just moved from 3 to 2 in the last few years. Number 2. The IMB, the Brazilian Baptist Convention, has about 1,000 international missionaries today around the world. South Korea has been number 2 for a number of years, and they just got overshadowed by Brazil. Brazil is like so gigantic. South Korea is the size of what, a medium-sized state in the United States? And they have sent more missionaries around the world than any other country except the U.S. for quite a number of years. And Brazil just overshadowed them a few years ago. And Brazil's, the country of Brazil is the size of the continental U.S. The area I worked in, the eastern Amazon, we just took the Amazon, cut it in half. I worked in the eastern half. There were some other missionaries working in the western half with rural people. Was twice the size of Texas. And if you went from the western tip. I'm facing you guys, so it's on this side, right? If you went from the western tip of the Amazon all the way over to Belém on the Atlantic Ocean, that's Los Angeles to Chicago distance. So it's just incredibly huge. And God is just at work in these places, and it's just been amazing to see it. So our goal was to kind of work ourselves out of a job, train other people to do what we do, and we were really able to do that. And we had an airplane to get around. It's twice the size of Texas. There's no roads, by the way. You just go inland, about a third of the state of Pará, for example. There's just no more roads. It's just rivers. There's one or two. There's a Trans-Amazon Highway, quote unquote, which is it's nice when you first start in the cities, 4 lanes and paved, and then all of a sudden it just turns into a 2-lane dirt road, and the bridges wash out half the time, and it's really, really difficult. It's better today than it was when we first started, but it's very, very difficult to travel in Brazil. And so we would use the airplane. For example, from Marabá to the next nearest city, Marabá had about 200,000 people. That's where we first lived. And then get to the next city up the river. It was a 3-day trip on the boat. And there's no road. I mean, you really just couldn't get there by road. 3 hours in the airplane. And so days became hours. So we worked with, one of the things we did was some medical missions. And we partnered with 2 boat ministries. The Brazilian Bible Society had a boat. They even had a little minor surgery center on the boat. They had dental chairs and a dental center on the boat, and they would go up and down and just do free medical care for people that needed it. And we would work with them. Well, the doctors and dentists were volunteers, and do you think they lived out in these really small rural areas? No, they lived in Belém, in the capital city of the state with 2.5 million people. So imagine you're a doctor or a dentist, and I come in and say, we got this trip coming up, we need doctors and dentists, would you like to volunteer? And you could be Catholic, they're good people. Yeah, I'll take a weekend off and I'll go help people. Okay, good. We're going to leave on Wednesday because it takes 3 days to get there, and we'll be 3 days on a boat, and then you'll work, maybe Friday afternoon, Saturday, Sunday, and then we'll come back and we'll get you back by the next Wednesday. How about that? You can't do that. But if you go in and say Friday afternoon we'll leave, and 3 hours later we'll be in the city where we're going to take out in the boat, and then you'll work 2 days over the weekend in some rural areas, and then if you can wait till Monday, I'll fly you back Monday morning. If not, we'll Sunday afternoon. If the weather's good, we'll come on back. And so we were able to do things that we couldn't do without that aircraft being available. But after 15 years, 2008, we kind of began to realize that plane was getting old and it needed a lot of maintenance and it was very expensive. And so I was talking with some guys at Willowbrook. We've been members there. They have a mission house. That's where we stayed, and that's how we connected with Willowbrook. And so one of the guys is like, well, why don't you just build an airplane? I was like, building? And I'm thinking like, kit plane made out of glue and paper or something. I'm like, it's rough terrain out there. You got to have something sturdy to land on those dirt strips in the Amazon, you know. He goes, no, there's really good stuff. And so I started looking, and sure enough, there's all this amazing stuff. And I won't go into a lot of detail and bore people, the technical people here. Airplane technology today just recently stepped out of the 1950s and 60s because it was not profitable to upgrade because it took so long to get certified by the FAA the plane was safe and airworthy with your new technology, and it cost so many $1 million to do that you couldn't sell enough planes to make your money back as far as little private airplanes. It just was not cost effective. And Cirrus and a few other companies have kind of jumped forward on that, and they've just done it, and now they are selling enough to make a profit, although the planes are very, very expensive. So the only way you could get contemporary technology on an airplane was build one yourself, and so it's allowed if you build it. And then if you build it, you can work on it because you built it, you know how to fix most of it. So these guys talked me into getting a team together at Willowbrook, and of course you got all these rocket scientists and engineers over there. And anyway, in about 8 or 9 months, we built an airplane, an RV-10. I flew it across the Caribbean on my way back to Brazil, and flew that the last few years I was there. And then when we got ready to leave, the International Mission Board just, it was every year I had to justify the airplane because it was fairly expensive still, and just say, here's what we're doing with this that we just wouldn't do if we didn't have the airplane. And every year they go, okay. And I'd get my budget. But finally, I began to think, we need to do things more efficiently so that the plane can be self-supporting by the people that want to use it. You know, the boats that from the Bible Society and others, they would have us fly their crew out because their crew had crew rests. They could only work so many days. Then they had to go home. Yeah, and they could only go so far up the river, then they have to turn around and come back because the crew has to be back. So they would go up the river, and I would meet them somewhere, pick up their crew, take it back, and they would keep going with their ministry because it takes them days to get where they're going. So we did things like that. And so we ended up putting the airplane into a nonprofit organization in Brazil, and it's still flying. I had the chance to fly it just a few months ago. You know, it's pretty amazing getting back in the cockpit of that airplane. I'll show pictures later if you guys want, but anyway, the IMB decided to take my airplane away. Now, I left the military as a pilot to go to seminary, and I gave up flying then. I thought I'll never fly again. Remember my last flight in a Cobra helicopter? I thought I'm gonna go have fun today because I'm not gonna be, I'm gonna be a pastor. I won't be able to afford an airplane. So went out and flew and landed and thought that's it, and then ended up getting in the reserves in an aviation unit. When I was in seminary. So during seminary, I was able to keep flying. I flew Huey helicopters. And so God kept that skill. And then before we went to the IMB, we were pastoring a church. We had known we were going to the mission field for the 7 years we'd been at that church. We planned to be there about 3 years, get some experience, and then go to the mission field. And church grew. We ended up staying longer. But I just remember one day a little envelope came from the International Mission Board, opened it up. It was their priority request. And it said, we need someone who's a pastor and can plant churches who's also a pilot. And it turns out there weren't very many of them. And they weren't just talking a private pilot, at least commercial level and capable of flying in, the conditions in Brazil. So I called them up and said, we're seeking to be missionary and stuff. And told my wife about it that evening. She was Now she was the one pushing missions the whole time. She was a GA. She got called to be a missionary when she was a teenager. She broke up with me when we started dating because I wasn't called to missions. I mean, it broke my heart. I thought she was the one, but I was called to ministry. I thought, well, I'm called to ministry. I'm going to seminary. Well, missions is something else. And so we were dating, and she broke up with me, and then God brought us back together, obviously. But she was, and I was just surprised. We just had Bethany. She's like 2 years old, and I should probably let her tell it, but she said all she could think of was a big snake was going to eat our daughter, and she's like, I'm not going to Brazil. And anyway, after prayer and a lot of God working, she said yes, and we took our, by then, 3-year-old daughter to Brazil, and she never got eaten by a snake. We did have some big snakes, but she didn't get eaten by one. But after that time, the IMB decided they were going to third party, anything to do with aviation around the world. And we had pilots around the world. There were 4 or 5 of us. I think I was the last one when they decided that the risk of an accident or something would just be really negative for the board if something happened, and the liability, they didn't want to hold that liability anymore. So we put it in another organization. There was a Brazilian pilot, mechanic, and others who took over the ministry. And so I don't know if they felt bad, because I just loved the flying part of my job. It was less than half of my job. The other half was getting in a 4-wheel drive, and if I could go by road, I would. It was cheaper. Or getting in a boat and going a day or 2 on a boat, sleeping in a hammock and going to where I needed to go. But the farther distance journeys, they just weren't feasible by 4-wheel drive or by boat. So I would fly, take the plane. Anyway, I don't know if they felt bad about it or what, but I went to a big meeting, and we had already been working the last year to transition things to other people that we were doing, and we were just going to be ready to be redeployed somewhere. And I'm thinking we'll go to, down to one of the big cities and work in Brazil, perhaps, since we speak the language, or maybe we would, go to some other very rural area in Africa or somewhere else. We really didn't know. We're just praying and being available to the Lord. And we didn't, the IMB never told us we needed to leave. They said our job was still a priority, but they really wanted to focus on larger populations of people. And then if you reach a city for Christ, the city will reach those rural areas over time. The people, the second generation of believers will. And that makes sense. And so we're working our way out of a job, and they call me into a meeting and say, we have a job for you that we'd like you to pray about. They're not, the IMB doesn't assign you a job. They ask you to pray about it. God has to call you to it. You don't stay in the Amazon jungle for 15 years because the IMB asks you to go there. You stay there because God told you to go there. And that's what keeps you there, because it was not, there were many, many tough times that we had over those years. And I think everybody but our son James had got dengue fever somewhere in that process. And you just get those tropical diseases and, all that crazy stuff. So anyway, and I thought, okay, so, what are we looking at? And he says, well, we need someone who speaks Spanish and Portuguese, or speaks one of the Latin languages fluently and can get by in the other one. And they said, don't you speak some Spanish? I'm like, my Spanish is terrible. I forgot most of it, but I did study Spanish in college. It helped me learn Portuguese. And then Portuguese, your brain imprints on things that are familiar, to help you remember. So Portuguese just imprinted on top of my Spanish. And I can hear it, and then I want to speak, and I have to translate in my head. And that's not the way you speak a foreign language. You just speak it. And when I try to just speak it, every other word is a Portuguese word instead of a Spanish word. And it doesn't work. But I think I'll be able to get it back. That's one of my goals, since we're back in the States, is to go back and work on Spanish. But I said, yeah, I can kind of get by in both languages. And they said, and you also know German, right? And I said, no, I don't know German. But I did have to take a year of German for my PhD program that I went through. So I did have some German. And they asked us to go to Germany and work with Latin American immigrants. So here we are. Obviously, a few years later, the kids are a little older. This was about, just back to the slide there, please. This was about 15 minutes up the hill, small mountain behind the house we lived in a town called Kandern, where our kids went to school at Black Forest. I told the committee, I think, did I tell you guys about when our oldest daughter, Bethany, called and wanted to speak to her sisters? Okay, so Bethany is off at college. She's 4 years older than the next daughter, Leah. And Leah and Allie and Bethany were just big buddies growing up. All 3 sisters hung out. So Bethany's in college in the U.S. We just moved to Germany, so it was about a year after we got there. She calls up and she says, can I speak with Leah, who's the second born? My wife says, well, Leah's not here right now. Now, this is the Bethany that grew up in the Amazon, running around barefoot, playing soccer with the boys. She was a little athlete and tomboy, and, playing with her friends in Portuguese in that part of the world. And now she's in college, so she calls, and then she says, Well, is Allie there? Allison. My wife says, no, Allie's not here either. I says, well, where are they? Well, they're on a school trip. She goes, oh, well, where'd they go? Well, it was their English class, so they went to London. Now, London was a $39 cheap flight, or you could take the train. It was not that far to get to when you live in Germany, and their class went to London, and they stayed in a hostel, and it didn't cost very much, So it was silent for a moment, and then Bethany said, London? Oh, they're in London. Where did I go on my school trip? I went to the Coca-Cola factory. She was just a little upset that we had moved to Europe, but she got over it. Anyway, as you can imagine, going from one season hot to 4 seasons very cold, it took us a little while to adapt. But the church that I pastored there for the first year was an international multicultural church in some ways, but the name of it was the Brazilian Baptist Church of Basel. A Igreja Batista Brasileira de Basel. So it was a Brazilian Baptist Church of Basel. And they had services in Portuguese, and they also translated into German. And God just did some amazing stuff during that time. They had gone through a split. We didn't know that. I was looking for a church. We were going to German churches trying to learn the language, and it was just overwhelming for our kids. They weren't getting it. They weren't in language school. They were in an American school, and they were learning German as a course. And so they weren't getting anything out of it. And we thought they're just, they can't connect with the kids their age, and it's just not working. I thought, and I really don't want to just go to an American church. There were some there in English. So I got on the internet, and sure enough, 15 minutes from our house, right across the border in Switzerland, is a Brazilian church. So we went and visited and they have their services at night. That's the big service in Brazil, is at night. The morning service, they have Sunday school. Many churches don't even have a morning service. It's hot, and their buildings, especially in the rural areas, it's like a tin-type roof. It's Brasilici, but it radiates heat like tin and brick walls, and you're just sweating to death. But by the time the sun goes down, it cools off a little bit. So they have their worship at 7 o'clock till 9 o'clock or whenever at night. So anyway, we found the church there and went. First week, met the pastor. He was just serving as an interim. Their pastor had left because of the split in the church, and he was a missionary in Africa, and he was supposed to be back in Brazil, but he had actually gone to Europe instead to help this church during this time. And then the next week when we went back, he said, well, he didn't get his visa to stay, so he was going to have to leave and go back to Africa. And so he asked if I would pastor the church. And so they had unlike your committee that did a very thorough job, which is admirable, they met me twice and said, would you pastor our church? And I did. And God turned things around. But I just remember, it's a whole nother world in Europe. Everybody speaks 2 or 3 languages. You know what you call somebody that speaks 2 languages? Bilingual, yeah. Now, if they speak 3, trilingual. Now, there's another word if they speak 4 or more. It's called a polyglot if you speak multiple languages, 4 or more. What do you call someone that speaks 1 language? American. And that's okay. We don't need to speak another language. And that's the same way in Brazil. Brazilians don't speak other languages much. It's a huge country, and they all speak Portuguese. That's their language, and they just don't have a need. And the Spanish-speaking countries, they pick up some Spanish to trade with them, and if they work in a field where they work with the United States, then they learn English, but they don't learn it unless they have to. It's just the way it is. But we're in Europe. So anyway, we're there, and we had a baptism service for a lady and her son. He's like 17 or 18. She's in her 40s, 30s, 40s. And they had started coming in and sitting in the back row of the church. And I noticed her, she put the little headphones on. We had headphones to translate into the local dialect of German, and they were back there. And a lot of times her son would be talking to her. And I thought, well, maybe she can't hear very well or something, and he's helping her understand. And they came forward one night to accept Christ. and wanted to be baptized. And so we began talking, and then I realized German wasn't a first language for her. She was from Turkey, and she spoke Turkish. And her son had come. They had moved to this area some years before, and he'd gone to school, and he spoke German fluently. So he was hearing in German, and he was translating into Turkish for her. And it was a bad translation. I mean, it was a local dialect of German that I couldn't understand, and I got to be okay in German, but it was just, they pronounced things so differently. So I'm teaching in English. No, I'm sorry, I'm teaching in a second language, Portuguese. That's not my first language. It's getting translated into a bad dialect of German for a Turkish speaker, and she understands the gospel and accepts Christ. So we're having the baptism, and the other pastor had just come, the new pastor that came, missionary, to come and take the church after we'd been there about a year. And so he was going to do the baptism, and I was there with him. He was in the baptistry. She comes up, and so he spoke to one of our church members in Portuguese that spoke German fluently. She was a ER nurse, and she had learned German, been in Europe there about 7 years, and she was very fluent. So he spoke to her in Portuguese. She's translating into German for the son, and he's translating into Turkish for the wife. So they do the baptism. And my wife is over here. We had a team of friends and stuff from the United States that had come to visit, and she's translating in English so they know what's going on. And we thought that was strange. And then I was reading back through the book of Acts. I just felt led to read the book of Acts and do it very detailed and study it. And I just realized that there's not a church in the New Testament that wasn't multicultural, multilingual. We weren't unusual, we were usual. And I think God did that because the gospel needed to spread quickly, and it did all around the world in many languages and many cultures. The gospel transcends these things of language and culture. It's beyond that, and the Holy Spirit can work in ways that we never understand. Anyway, we had about 7 years in Europe, and once again we kind of worked ourselves out of a job. They had a huge influx of Islamic people. About 2.5 million came into Germany. Angela Merkel just brought them in. They were refugees, most of them from Syria, from the war in Syria, and from conflicts, and a lot from other Arabic countries as well came in. And we began to work with them, and we had colleagues that came, and we helped them get into houses and get things figured out, because by then we spoke the language pretty well. So they came in quickly to try to deal with this, and we helped them do that, and then they could speak the languages. And there were a lot of the kids, teenagers, and some that were in college and stuff that spoke English, and we could speak with them. And God did an amazing work. There was one couple. I'm kind of going on long here. Am I boring you guys to death? There's one couple that lived in Vienna. She was Brazilian. He was Austrian. She went to seminary and had a heart for missions and felt like God was calling her to missions. But in the whole process, she had an incredible voice. She sang for Billy Graham for a crusade, and she became rather well known in Brazil. And through that, the oil company, which is a national oil company in Brazil, gave her a scholarship to go to Vienna and study voice and opera. And she met a guy, got married, had kids. 10 years, 15 years later, she's a citizen. She speaks the language fluently. She's teaching music. And she and her husband, he'd worked as a missionary in Africa for a while. They are planting a church in their apartment. And they just finished planting a Vietnamese church. And they've now got it. It's got a location. It's got a leader that they've trained that's leading it. And so they're kind of like just finished doing a church planting job there in Austria. And she's brushing her teeth one day, and God says, I want you to speak to the Persians. And she's, Persians? I don't know any Persians. Thought it was really strange, but really felt it was God speaking to her. So a few days later, she's having a meal with a lady that's a friend of hers. And this lady had invited another young lady to come and have coffee or meal with them. And she noticed this young lady spoke with an accent. She spoke very well in German, spoke with an accent. And she just said, well, where are you from? She says, I'm from Iran. And she says, what do you speak in Iran? In German, in the German language, they don't say Farsi. the language of Iran is Persian. And so she said, I speak Persian. And she just thought, oh, that's the person I'm supposed to talk to. And she said she got really nervous. She didn't know what to do. She had been told by her friend that she was Islamic, she was Muslim. So she just decided to talk to her. She says, well, you're living in Europe now. Our culture is Christian anyway, Judeo-Christian. And I have a Bible study in my home. Would you like to come? She said, oh, yeah, I'd love to. Can I bring some friends? It turns out she had come to Europe, gotten her degree there, and was working. She was an immigrant. She'd had her green card there. She was working there, and she was volunteering at the camp to translate for Farsi speakers when they had to go to the doctor or when they had to fill out papers for the government or whatever. She was doing volunteer translating. So she had all these friends that she's translating for. She just invited them, and the next thing you know, she's got 40 people in her apartment, in a little European apartment, not very big. The police are coming. The fire department's come. You can't do this. You got too many people. It's. So a friend of mine found out about this and said, and he said he was just passing through Europe on a trip, and he said, you need to go there. And so my wife and I went and met her and her husband. The night that we went, they had 48 people in her apartment. They were singing in German, a little bit of Portuguese. She sang a song in Portuguese, and then they were singing in Farsi. I don't know what they were singing, but they were dancing and jumping up and down. And she came over to me and says, they're saying, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Lord. There's no other Lord but Jesus. And, so here are these people that have come to faith in another country because of a war that's going on. And there's an awakening going on in Iran. It's just amazing. So we ended up working with her. So I helped them find a church. We found a Baptist church. As a Baptist pastor, I could go to the Baptist convention there in Austria and say, hey, is there a church can help sponsor this group? I'll vouch for them. They're solid. And so they found a church that would host them so they could move out of her home and have a place to meet. Were you wanting to ask something? Okay. And in the process, I ended up baptizing about half of the group. There were over 100 that were baptized. And you rarely see Muslims become believers and get baptized. They'll come into the faith, but baptism separates them, from everything. A lot of them had families disown them and had all kinds of issues, but they did. They wanted to follow Jesus. I would have never dreamed if you had told me that would be what I was doing. When we went there, we were going to work with Latin American immigrants. We weren't planning on working with all these other people groups. I don't speak their language. I know a little of their culture. I've studied world religions, so I know what the differences in our faith is, and I could help them navigate that. But why would God call me to do that? But he did. So the two big experiences, one of them I was uniquely prepared for. I'd been a pastor, I could plant churches, had my seminary, my master's degree at the time, and I could fly aircraft. And so that job fit very neatly. The other one, I could not speak Farsi or Arabic. I'd never worked in a Muslim country. I didn't really know how to engage with refugees. I'd never done refugee work. But it just came, and God just used me because I was there. So if you ask, how does God work? It's any way he wants to. And what should we do? Work with him when he calls us. So as we're looking at the community around us and we're thinking, what's next? You may have a gift or a skill that will help connect with someone who needs the gospel. Use that. Do that. You may say, I don't have a gift or a skill. God will use you. David was anointed long before he did anything that would have made him in any way, fashion, or form look like a king. And God can call you and then gift you in the things that you're going to do. And I just want to challenge you as we're going on this. I don't know what's ahead. I just know we're going to pray, and what God wants is people to come to Christ and people to be discipled and to grow in their faith. He wants lives transformed. And driving around this community a couple of times and walking some of the community, it looks to me like there's people out there that I don't want to judge them superficially, but they look like they need their lives transformed. And we just need to take the gospel, and we need to let God do the rest. How we're going to do it, we're going to try to do it. It's going to be how God leads us to do it, but we're going to try to do things that you can do, whether it's just walking through the neighborhood and saying, we have a group that prays, and we've committed to pray for people that live around our church. How can we pray for you? You don't have to share the gospel the first time you meet somebody. If you get a chance, do it. But a lot of people aren't really open to the gospel the first time you talk to them. And we're going to be here a while. At least the church is. God could take me home tomorrow. I don't know. But we're going to be here to share the gospel. If you get the opportunity, share the gospel. But if it's not a natural moment to share the gospel, then pray for them. Try to make a connection or a contact. When they were talking about the web page, the only thing that I'm thinking in there is if we can be more efficient and more effective and connect with people, then that's what we got. We've got to connect with people. And most of you guys, probably like me, most of your friends are already believers and they already have a church home, and the people you hang out with don't need you to share the faith with them. But if you do have connections through work or school, use those connections as well. And we're going to do this together, and God's going to lead us. I feel like Joshua standing outside of Jericho looking at those walls, like there is no way. We can't climb those walls. We can't knock them down. They're going to be throwing big stones on our heads when we get up there. What are we going to do? And the angel of the Lord shows up, and Joshua, he's got his sword in his hand, and Joshua does the military thing. Are you friend or foe? Are you on our side or the enemy's side? And he answers, no. He says, I'm the angel of the Lord. And Joshua gets it. God's not on our side. We're on his side. And we need to be on God's side. And we're going to be on God's side, and he's going to show us what to do. I'm confident of that. If I've learned nothing else on the mission field, if you pray and you wait on the Lord and you're available, God will show you, and he'll lead you, and it'll be the right thing to do, and he's going to do that for us. So I'd like for us just to pray. Let me go through the rest of the slides real quick. There's about 3 more, I think. This is where we lived the last 3 years. I taught seminary in Sao Paulo, city of 28 million people, 4th largest city in the world. If I didn't go early to one of the classes I taught, it would take me 2 to 3 hours just to drive a 15, 20-minute drive just because of traffic. It was crazy there. This is our kids at, I think, this last Christmas. I'm going to have to look this way. On the bottom left, that's Cindy, my wife, in the red and blue sweater. Next to her is Allie, Bethany, Bailey. Bailey is my son's wife. He's sitting right behind her. And then it's me, John, that's Bethany's husband, James, Leah. And Leah is engaged, but she got engaged after this, so her fiance is not with us. Just real quick, we'll go through this. John and Bethany, this is their marriage, their graduation from UAB Medical School. And this is Leah. She's a nurse, and the picture there with her holding the little baby. She works with labor and delivery is the specialty she's working in right now. And so she was on a mission trip in Guatemala, I think it was. And while she was on that mission trip, met a young medical student who was on that mission trip, and then they started dating, and they're engaged now. His name is Will. Bethany's about 5'2". He's 6'9", so they make a perfect couple. I was looking at their engagement pictures and saw, like, oh my gosh, he just towers over her. He is so big. This is Allie. She graduated from UAH as an engineer. She works for Craft Design here in Huntsville, and that's Allie singing at Willowbrook, Madison. She and Leah both sang in their praise band. Leah is doing travel nursing, trying to make money for her wedding and all that, and Allie still sings there. And I think and this is James and Bailey. That's their wedding picture on the right, and there's a picture of James. This is graduation picture in Black Forest Academy on the other side. And they live here. So James and Bailey live here in Huntsville, and Allie still lives here in Huntsville as well. And this is Penelope, the newest member of the family. with John and Bethany. And hopefully you'll get to see them this Sunday. I think that's it. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's pray. I went late, didn't I? Did I go late? I usually put my phone up here with a timer, and I didn't do that, so forgive me. Let's pray for those that are on our list. Does someone here have a list that could just read them for us? Oh, okay.